Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm Bruce Jones. I'm the director of the Project on International Order and Strategy at the Brookings Institution, and it's my pleasure to host this event today, focused on Russia's role in a changing global order, and also focused on Kathryn Stoner's terrific new book, Russia. We have several hundred people with us on the call today. That doesn't happen without quite a lot of effort from the back office team, so to speak. I want to start by thanking Kristen Bellel, Adam Twodorsky, and Suzanne Schaefer for helping put on today's event. Virtual events are almost as much work as in-person events, so my warm thanks to them. My thanks to the audience for joining us, and of course, a very warm thank you to the panel members for joining us at Brookings today. I'll introduce you in just a quick moment. I just quickly want to give a shout out to two additional people who helped draw attention to the event. President Biden and Vladimir Putin were so kind as to schedule their summit the day after this event. I thought that was rather nice of them to help draw attention to Kathryn's book. So we'll cover the issues of the summit, but we're going to start with the book. It's a terrific panel to talk about Russia and Russia-US relations today. I'll first start with Kathryn Stoner, who is the author of Russia Resurrected. She's the deputy director of the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University and a senior fellow at the Center for Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law on faculty at Princeton University for several years, and the author of several previous books on Russian governance and on post-communist Russia, and obviously the author of the book we're here to talk about today. Paul Post is an associate professor of political science at the University of Chicago and a non-resident fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Primarily writes about alliances and international organization dynamics, very innovative in his use of quantitative data to study international security dynamics, all of which have frequently brought him to focus on Russia's unusually expansive role in international crisis and international security questions. His most recent book is Arguing About Alliances. He's also by far the best academic tweeter I know of, including on questions of international order and grand strategy. Our own Fiona Hill is the Robert Bosch Senior Fellow in the Center for the United States and Europe in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings. In the early 2000s, she was the National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. She's written extensively about Russian foreign policy throughout her career, including most recently a major book with Cliff Gaddy called Mr. Putin, Operative in the Kremlin. And then most recently and rather famously served as Deputy Assistant to the President and Senior Director for Eurasian and Russian Affairs, European and Russian Affairs at the National Security Council from 2016 to 2019. So it's a terrific panel with which to discuss Russian issues. I want to start, Kathryn, with you. I'm going to provoke you by reminding you of two famous formulations about Russia. One by President Obama shortly after the annexation of Crimea, in which he dismissed Russia as a, quote, regional power. I thought it was an odd formulation at the time, given that the region in question was Europe, but nonetheless, that was his formulation. And then even more colorfully, John McCain used to refer to Russia as a gas station with nuclear weapons. Having read your book, I take it that you disagree. Kathryn, you're muted, I think.
Okay, we were group muted, but I managed to get myself back here. Well, first, thank you very much, Bruce, for having me, and thank you to Fiona and to Paul and to the Brookings team for putting this together. And yes, thank you to Mr. Putin and Mr. Biden. Wow, great timing. It probably has to do with more than me and my book, however. So right, the book gets at this issue of conflicting perceptions, really, of power, and in particular of Russian power and Russia's role in the world. So as you mentioned, Mitt Romney, John McCain, rather infamously made these remarks about Russia being little more than a gas station with nuclear weapons. I think John McCain, it was a gas station masquerading as a country. Mitt Romney, it's a gas station nuclear with nukes, he said a year or so after that. And Barack Obama, really hurting Vladimir Putin's feelings, called it a regional power in 2014. And I think what we're starting to see, and the reason that I wrote this book, is that there was a kind of traditional way of looking at power in evaluating Russia this way. And frequently people say Russia is punching above its weight. And so I wanted to see if that was true, or maybe whether or not we were, thinking of power in sort of narrow realist terms. Because, I think what McCain and Romney are thinking of, and Obama, was that in comparative terms, Russia has, a GDP of about $1.7 trillion compared to the US's of, over 20 trillion. China's is over 14 trillion. Russia's, just for comparative, perspective, is about the same as Canada's at 1.7 trillion. Its population is, 144, 145 million people, depending on whether or not you count Crimea in there since 2014. US, of course, we have about 325, 330 million people. China, way over a billion. Russia spends about a tenth of what the US does on its military. So if you look at these kind of traditional measures, what we might call men, military, and money, and you add them up, Russia doesn't look very remarkable, less, about 3% of global GDP. And yet it's been tremendously disruptive in international politics. And so I think dismissing it in the way that McCain and Romney and even Obama did, where he was insinuating it was only influential in the former Soviet region, underestimated what Russia has the ability to do. And I think partly that's because they thought of power in these traditional terms, and they were unaware of some of the changes that have transpired in Russia in 30 years. So the book goes through evaluating the means, that is men, military, and money, these traditional means of power. But it also looks at geographic domain, where Russian influence has expanded in the last 15 years in particular, and then the policy scope, in what particular policy areas Russia is engaged, and its weight, how important it is. So I'll just say that that I hope the book makes two corrections in how we think about Russia. That first of all, Russia has considerable tools, power tools, that it's not just punching above its weight, but that it's actually pretty weighty in some areas once we look beyond the traditional measures of men, military, and money, and that power is multidimensional. And it is contextual, right? So if a good hand of cards in bridge isn't necessarily a good hand of cards in poker. It depends on the context of the game, of course. And a country's power tools can be good enough, as Russia's are, to be tremendously disruptive, depending on the context. And then the second corrective is the characterization of Russia as weak, I think is outdated. And so while you, Bruce, quoted Obama and Romney, and I added Romney, and you quoted McCain as well, I could add Phil Breedlove, also speaking in 2015, saying that Russia's trying to change the Cold War settlement using force, or Generals Dunford, for example, and Odera saying Russia is an existential threat to the United States. And President Biden ultimately in October of last year, when he was running for president, identifying Russia as the biggest threat to America in terms of breaking up security and alliances, and saying that China is a competitor, but Russia is actually capable of breaking up American security and American alliances. So the point is, we're thinking about power too narrowly. When we think of it more expansively, things look different. And so I offer different measures of power in addition to these traditional means. And then I point out that Russia has become disruptive, in particular under Mr. Putin's regime, because there's something about Putinism, and that not only does Russia have considerable relative power, disruptive power in particular, but Mr. Putin, under the kind of authoritarianism that has emerged, in particular, I say, since about 2012, 2013, has the will to use what Russia has pretty much unconstrained. That domestic politics drive some aspects of Russian foreign policy, not to deny that Russia has interests, all states have interests, but that not all Russian leaders would use Russian power resources this way, and that the type of regime matters in determining Russian foreign policy decisions and the deployment of its power resources. So there's something about Putinism. So maybe I'll just stop there and see where our conversation goes after that. But that's the essential thrust of the argument.
I just want to pull out a couple of themes that are in the book that you touched on here in terms of the scope of Russian power. I'm particularly struck by the emphasis on the oil and gas sector, where Russia has obvious strengths. I was just rereading Dan Yergin's The New Map, where sort of Russia's ability to wield those instruments comes very strongly to the fore, as well as what have been referred to as sharp power instruments, social media influencing, cyber operations, etc. And then the ability to fuse those together in hybrid operations of substantial significance. And I think that point that you ended on about the willingness to use these levers of power and sort of unconstrained in the exercise of doing so is substantial. You end up calling Russia a good enough power. It's a very Krasnerian phrase. I think you're influenced by your setting there. You do.
He's a good friend. Yeah.
You do talk about Russia as a formidable challenge to the stability of the post-war order. I want to bring in Fiona and Paul for their thoughts and comments, and we'll sort of engage in a conversation around the book. Fiona, why don't you come in first?
Certainly, thanks a lot, and congratulations to Kathryn on the book. It's a really important corrective to all of these points about the way that we assess power and how we think that countries will operate. I mean, I think on one point, just to elaborate on something that Kathryn said, thinking about Putin and Putinism, I think it's more about the man himself and his background, and then the kind of people that he's attracted around him, rather than an ideology per se. And I think that's something that, a point that Kathryn is actually making, throughout the book as well, because it's the nature of the person that makes it more likely that he will use the tools at the disposal. And we could go on at going down the list of tools, novel ways of assassinating people. Be it the use of polonium, Novichok was what used to be a highly classified banned nerve agent that most people didn't even know existed, let alone that it might be used in an assassination attempt. The use of paramilitary forces and proxy forces, the Wagner Group. Criminals for hire, which is something the KGB has done, back since the 1970s. And in the old days, it would be criminals that might break into businessmen's bedroom in a hotel in sort of St. Petersburg and plant something or take something away. Now, these criminals can, sit at a distance in some faceless hotel room themselves and hack into someone's computer and exfiltrate all of the data or hold their systems for ransom. So, we have a lot of suspicions that these ransomware attacks are perpetrated by Russian actors who may be giving a nudge and a wink by Vladimir Putin and other people in the Kremlin, or they may in fact be directed by them, as in the old days, going back to the 70s, when the KGB actually instructed or encouraged criminals to take some action. There was honey traps, prostitution rings, drugs, you name it. So, basically, the point is that Putin comes out of the dirty tricks department of the Soviet Union, going back until the 1970s. He was someone who saw his career and path to power through the back corridors and through the black operations of the state. And the point that Kathryn is really making here is that it's kind of Putin unleashed, the guys who do the black ops unleashed. In the Soviet era, we had checks and balances. It was actually a more predictable era, and the ruthlessness was somewhat constrained, even though, when we look back, there were plenty of assassinations. Think Georgy Markov on London Bridge with a rice impellant, stuck in the back of his car by an umbrella. But, we weren't, hearing about this day in day out. That seemed to be confined more to the world of spies and, the John le Carré, type activities. Now this seems to be, common. De rigueur for the Russians to do this, and some of the attacks that they inflict on military or intelligence targets are so brazen that they have collateral damage. In the case of the attempted poisoning of Sergei Skripal, a former Russian spy, living on a new assumed life in Salisbury in England, Dawn Sturgis, an innocent British woman, was killed in the course of that operation. Many other people were sickened, and a whole town had to be put in lockdown because the agents who perpetrated that had enough nerve agent in a perfume bottle they'd concealed it in to kill 4,000 people. So there's a kind of sense of loss of proportion, loss of restraint, loss of the checks and balances in the system. And I think that that's kind of really important to Kathryn's story as well, because they have kind of unleashed the whirlwind. There is a ruthlessness and aggression that makes Russia formidable. And it's because of the person of Vladimir Putin. And as Kathryn suggests, another person might do something differently. We saw under Dmitry Medvedev a more restrained version of the same system, because Dmitry Medvedev was an actual lawyer who, kind of is a sort of a contemporary of all of ours, who, came to prominence during perestroika in the late Gorbachev period and always had above board jobs, and, was not the head of the dirty tricks department. So, we can really see that it's the nature of Putin himself and the system which makes him something to be reckoned with. And I think that that's an important point of Kathryn's book, is to really look at the tools that are under the disposal, because regular countries are not using tools like this.
Paul, let me bring you in here, both for your comments on the book or questions, but also your perspective on sort of Russian foreign policy as a whole, and how you see this fitting into the longer story of Russian foreign policy.
Absolutely. And first of all, Bruce, thank you for the invitation to participate in this. And thank you, Kathryn, for allowing me the privilege of reading this book. I really enjoyed this book. I sent out a tweet about it this morning, and I really mean that. This is a book that in the research I'm doing right now, I'm going to be continually referring to it. And I want to share a little bit about why that is, because for me, I think there's three big takeaways I had from this book. And the first one was this idea of good enough, great power. This is a great concept. And for me, it explains Russia very well, not just in the current era, but historically. If we really think about Russia, it's always been a good enough, great power. During the Cold War, there was always this view that Russia was 100 feet tall, and then it turned out, no, the economists were wrong. Russia's economy was actually much weaker. Same thing going back prior to World War I. There was this view that, oh yes, the Russian war machine is going to start cranking. Well, no, it turns out it's actually really hard to get the Russian military moving, and they have mobilization issues. Russia, this was part of the reason why people talk about that, well, communism kind of skipped several steps when it was implemented there, because they went from an agrarian society straight to that. And so Russia has always been this good enough, great power, except the difference is, and this is something I really like from the book, is today we tend to underestimate Russia in this regard. Whereas in a lot of those cases I talked about in the past, we were overestimating Russian power, Russian ability, Russian influence. And so I think that Russia's kind of been the same. It's our perception of Russia that has very much changed. And of course, we could talk about the end of the Cold War in the 1990s being a big reason why maybe now we're underestimating, whereas in the past we were always overestimating. So this is one big theme from the book that I think is just very important to take away. And again, I really like that phrase of good enough, great power. And I'm going to see myself using that a lot, because it really works well for Russia, but I could also see for a host of other countries as well. And this actually leads to another big point about, well, why is it that Russia is a good enough, great power? And this is something that I've seen when looking at Russia's foreign policy and Russia's tendency to, in the phrase of a friend of mine, always play the heavy. It seems like if you go back over the past 200 years, who was it that the British tend to always be concerned about? What was the great game about in Central Asia? It was Russia. And then, of course, we jump forward. What was Germany about? What was the rise of Germany? Who was the big threat for them? Was it really France? No, it was Russia. And then we think about the United States after World War II. Who is it? It's Russia. So it's always Russia that seems to play the role of the heavy. And the question is, why is that? Especially if it's a good enough, great power. It's not this major 100-foot tall behemoth. Well, the reason why, and this is a point that's very well emphasized in the book, is geography. As Dave Kang at the University of Southern California has said, Russia is the only country that is both a European power and an East Asian power. And it's simply because of geography. You don't have to have the same economic base that the United States has when projecting power simply means going across your border. And because of Russia's border, how many countries it borders, this land mass, it can easily project power to East Asia, Central Asia, the Middle East, the Arctic, and Europe, as well as the near abroad, as it likes to refer to the former Soviet republics. So it's possible for Russia to do this with a much lower economic baseline than, say, the United States, where, of course, because of the United States geographic position, we have to be able to send in an aircraft carrier group. We have to be able to have long-range bombers. We have to have these capabilities just because it is much more difficult, more expensive for us to be able to project power. But for Russia, that's never been the case. The big challenge for Russia has always been internal mobilization. And if you go back historically, that was the big dispute between France and Russia when they were allies, was the French were frustrated about Russia not doing enough to improve their railroads so they could actually mobilize internally. But it's never been a matter of Russia having to have the same economic baseline for power projection. And so I think that that is a key point that comes out of Kathryn's book. It's a point that I'm finding in my own research about Russia historically, and it's a point that I know I'm going to be coming back to again and again. So I really like that this is there. Also because I think this is a point that's very much underappreciated in general, the role of geography in international politics. My colleague at the University of Chicago, John Mearsheimer, is famous for using the phrase, the stopping power of water. But I think most of us have to really take that more seriously, that Russia doesn't face that to the same extent as the United States does. This leads then to the third point, the third big takeaway from the book. And it actually dovetails very nicely on a topic that Fiona was just bringing up in her remarks, which is thinking about the role of Putin. And for me, I had a little bit of a different takeaway from the book. For me, when I was reading this book, a book that kept coming to mind for me was A.J.P. Taylor, famous historian. And not his famous, the book that most people refer to him as, which is The Struggle for Mastery in Europe, but his book, The Origins of the Second World War, which was published in 1960. And the reason why this book at the time was controversial, and the reason why it was controversial is because he was taking on the claims at the time that the war in Europe was solely the fault of Hitler. It's like, if you remove Hitler, you do not have a war in Europe. And what he was pushing back against was, well, yes, Hitler had certain character traits. Hitler had a certain risk tolerance that other leaders didn't. But he pointed out that it was the nature of the German system that enabled someone like Hitler to come to power. He also pointed out that there was something about the structure of Europe at the time that made it tolerable for someone like Europe to come to power. Namely, that the British were willing to say, you know what? Hitler, I think in the phrase of Halifax, the foreign minister, is our, quote, bulwark against Bolshevism. They were willing to tolerate someone like that because of the other strategic interests that these powers had. And so Taylor was pushing back against this idea of just simply saying it's this person and their unique personality. He's saying, yes, that person has a personality. Yes, that person has a risk tolerance. But we need to think about how the system enables someone, both the domestic system as well as the structural international system, enables someone like that to be in power. And for me, that really speaks to the question about Putinism. Yes, there is something about Putin, but if it wasn't Putin, would there be someone else who would be in power who would also want to use these levers and use them in unique ways and use them in ways that other powers don't use them and have this same type of high-level risk tolerance that we don't see of other countries? So that's the third big point that I took away from this book. But again, I really enjoyed reading this. It gave me a lot to think about, and I know I'm going to be constantly referring back to it. So thank you so much.
Great. And now this is an important theme that I wanted to pull out, because I do think the three of you have slightly different takes. These are nuances, but there is a slight difference in take about sort of the structure of geography and history, the nature of the system, the role of the individual. They're all three of you write about the interaction, but you do put slightly different emphasis or weightings on them. So Kathryn, maybe you want to react to what Fiona and Paul have said and bring to that part of the book, the nature of the patronage system, the nature of the resource accumulation, and the way that drives some of Putin's behavior.
Sure. Well, first, thank you, Fiona and Paul, for generous comments and reading the book. I really appreciate it. It was definitely fun to write, and it went in a different direction than I necessarily intended at the beginning, when I thought actually I could write a quick and dirty, more or less pamphlet that corrected Mr. Putin's perception of the Russian power relative to the United States. getting to the kind of the one of the, just in reacting to Paul on the estimates of power. One of the quotes in the book of Mr. Putin, and he himself is paraphrasing, I think without attribution, Churchill and Talleyrand, that says Russia is never as weak as thought, but never as strong as it wants to be. So, historically, I would agree, this has been an issue in terms of properly gauging or calibrating Russia's relative influence globally. And I think it's often because we do look at the wrong things, right? So as you mentioned, Russia has 14 international borders. China is the only other country in the world that has so many. It's geographically the largest country, so it's naturally in the world. It's going to naturally affect other countries just because of that. But it's also beyond geography. It's what Russia has, and I guess this in part gets to what Bruce is talking about. One of the dimensions of power that I look at, and actually just getting back to the pamphlet idea of, and what Russia has, relatively speaking, I was struck that, when in 2015 in Syria, we saw Russia's one little coal-powered aircraft carrier steaming its way into the Mediterranean. And it was kind of sad, but, and I thought, oh, well, there you go. That's what I'm talking about. But actually, they don't need aircraft carriers in the way that the United States does. We have 11 active aircraft carriers because that's what we need, given where we are. They don't need that. They're closer to the Middle East, and they can actually, as we saw in Syria, launch their cruise missiles from the Caspian Sea area and still hit northern Syria. Not at first. It was kind of sloppy at first, but then things got better. But what Russia has, the sort of the weight of Russia in certain policy areas, and Bruce, you had mentioned that you were reading Dan Yergin's book. I think The Prize, is that the one you were you read most?
The new map, which is really about sort of the change in directions of energy flows and the way
yes,
geostrategic.
Yeah. So ironically, I have also been reading that. I've read the whole series, which is great. So Russia figures very prominently in those because it has this particularly valuable resource, right? And it has had it since I think the 1830s or so, 1850s when they first found oil. But that alone makes it a particularly weighty actor economically. So even if we look at the size of its GDP, yeah, relatively speaking, I'll confess that I am Canadian by birth. It's about the size of my country's GDP. And you guys aren't too worried about Canada coming across the border. And well, actually, Bruce, you're a countryman as well, coming across the border and, disrupting American elections or whatever. And that's because of the nature of the political system, of course, that constrains that. And also, Canadian interests are not to be disruptive of American politics and economics. And I would argue Russian interests aren't really there either. This is something about, in terms of disrupting, this is something about Putin. So to address the question of, would another leader behave the same way? Well, I think it depends on regime type, getting to Paul. And as Fiona said, there's something particular about Putin's background in terms of who's around him. So, it's not unreasonable for a leader to hire someone if they worked for McKinsey or Brookings or, Ford, if they're leading something, to hire people they know in that area, right? So at its most benign, the most benign interpretation is this is what Putin has done. He knew people in the KGB, and so he put those folks in. Well, he also hired, well, not hired officially, but he also has as a very close friend a concert cellist, the richest cellist in the world, arguably. Why? Well, we think because he's holding money for Putin, right? So one of the things they do as well, which we haven't talked about, is steal from the state. And so, they benefit from having control over state assets and making risk of using those assets public while taking, gains into their personal possession. So, why does this regime act this way? Well, one, it is because of Putin's background, as Fiona noted, but two, this is also, as I call it, and I'm using, in part of a term that Henry Hale has used and others have used. It's a patronal, autocratic, and now very personalistic authoritarian system. There is a group around Putin that benefits from controlling the state and those assets. And for now, until we all drive electric cars, and I think I have successfully convinced my husband to get a Tesla out here, but we have to wait now because of supply chain problems. And it's only 2 to 3% of the American population that's driving electric cars. Very even smaller percentage around the world. 80% of the world's energy is coming from carbon exports or carbon sources. Pardon me. Who's sometimes number one, sometimes number two in global carbon exports? Russia. So don't just look at its GDP. Look at what that GDP is comprised of. And yes, it's export revenue dependent. In the long run, that's not good for Russia. In the long run, they need to diversify their economy. But I would argue that this regime doesn't really look at the long run. There are some efforts, as I document in the book, at diversification. They also sell nuclear plants. They also sell weapons. But there's underinvestment in R&D. So I think another sort of thing to note about this regime is that its time horizons are quite short, right? The long run, as it turns out, could be 5 to 10 years at most. And also some of the conflicts it's trying to get in are, it must win because it's existential for this particular group of actors around Putin to remain where they are. So I do think it's a particular kind of system led by a particular kind of person. So I guess typically Canadianly, I come down in the middle between Paul and Fiona.
Canadians disrupt international affairs by penetrating academic and think tank institutions rather than power. I want to pivot to the summit in a minute, but before I do, Fiona, I want to ask you, let's leave aside the politicians. Inside the intelligence system, inside the national security establishment, inside the NSC, inside our administration, is it your assessment that the professionals have a right-sized assessment of the threat that Russia poses, or non-threat?
Yeah, look, I think it is. And, perhaps, our intelligence guys and girls are a bit more like Canadians as well. Because, obviously I posed, my views of the sort of Putin phenomenon rather starkly from, picking up on some of the issues in Kathryn's book. But of course, there's, a lot of structures around Putin that are intrinsic in the state and things that Yeltsin did, by amending the constitution. In fact, when Kathryn and I were both together in grad school doing our PhDs, in fact, back in the 1990s, that facilitated the rise of Putin. The checks and balances were stripped away. There was a constitution that became hyper-presidential. The Russian Duma over time, the parliament, its authorities were frittered away. Putin was able to free or liberate himself from having to be part of a political party. Yeltsin already started down that path. Kathryn and I were actually sitting in the same graduate seminars with Professor Tim Colton at this time, studying it all in real time. And so, we actually remember a lot of these themes and the way that this developed. So, Paul is right. There's a lot of things that are inherent in the system, and that another person succeeding Putin could avail themselves of many of the same tools. But the peculiarity about Putin, which is what our intel, guys and others focus on, is that he is a black ops, dirty operations guy from the intel world. And he thinks like a strategic planner. I mean, he doesn't have, Clausewitzian goals. Think more Ho Chi Minh and, burying under and, subversion and, kind of other means of kind of getting at the enemy. And he does think about all of this illicit tools. So when Kathryn made the point, which I think is an extraordinarily good one, an important one, about looking at the composition of GDP and oil and gas and trying to leverage oil and gas, I mean, we see them doing that. And of course, time may not be on their side over the long term, but as Kathryn's saying, this is a very short-term group of think around Putin, although Putin's short term happens to be up to 2036 right now, which is a bit of a long term, but I think they're betting that hydrocarbons won't have completely be gone by then, even if Kathryn is already starting up the trend of everyone getting Teslas and they're more affordable now. And, they're kind of banking on the fact that somehow still out to 2036 will be mostly in a hydrocarbon world, and they're not seeing a great urgency to run out to renewables, although frankly, the recent developments on the boards of companies like ExxonMobil could accelerate that. So we'll see. Kathryn may be well ahead of the trend, not just in writing the book, but also in her car purchase. But the other point is that Vladimir Putin and others have not just, as I was mentioning, nasty substances, paramilitary forces, criminal hackers and ransomware, teams, for example, but they also have a lot of illicit finance. So there's a lot of off the books money that's stashed away. And that is another element that we've got to factor in. And I think it's one that we're coming to the, to respond to your question, to understand even more so about how important that might be. So Russia, kind of got kicked out of the G8. It's no longer, kind of within the G20, kind of one of the major financial players on the official licit finance side. But on the illicit finance side, I would argue that Russia is one of the most consequential players. And part of the problem is our own vulnerabilities. There's been a lot of meetings and events on the London laundromat, where oligarchs in Russia and, Kremlin influencers are parking their money in London. There's the huge book by Kathryn Belton, former FT, another investigative journalist, Putin's People. She's now being sued by oligarchs left, right, and centre in London for the information that she has unearthed, showing that she was onto something. I mean, Kathryn, touches on some of this as well, but hopefully won't be sued. I don't think your book has laid yourself open to this, but you are laying out the same issues.
Careful,
that we'll be careful here. But the point is that illicit finance is insidious and it's incredibly powerful. And here in the United States as well, there's a realization, not just in our intelligence community, but in Congress and elsewhere, that we have to shore up our defenses, because we have plenty of places from, Miami to Delaware to New York to out in California, where Kremlin influencers are parking money, using money, trying to get into think tanks, into universities, and, you name it, we've got a problem there. And so I think that is something we're helping to, figure this out. And I think Kathryn's book really helps to frame this in the appropriate way of really making us very careful about how we're thinking about this, the tools that we use and how power can be measured, because illicit power is very significant.
Paul, I want to give you 1 minute if you want to come in on any of these themes before we shift to the summit.
I mean, I think that the conversation here is very much highlighted that when someone reads this book, they're probably going to want to think for themselves exactly the issue that we've been talking about, which is, to what extent is it about the state? To what extent is it about Putin? And to what extent is it about how the two interact? And for me, I really think that that's what's key. I wouldn't question at all that there are certain characteristics about Putin's background that makes him particularly more risk tolerant or willing to use more black ops, even cyber, all sorts of different, if you will, sharp power, as the phrase was used in the book and is used elsewhere, sharp power tools. But I do think that the nature of the system, NATO expansion, pushback to NATO expansion, something that Putin likes to latch on to, as well as the domestic system, makes it so that someone like Putin is in power. And I think that that's, to me, really a key thing. But again, I think that this is highlighted that someone will have to read the book to see for themselves which way they would fall in terms of that interpretation.
Good, which also should encourage them to buy the book at Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com or your favorite local bookstore. Let's shift to the summit. It seems to me that of all of the areas of Biden's foreign policy so far, he's least clear on what he wants out of the Russia strategy, other than a sense of like, please let this go away so I can focus on the things I really want to do. But and that requires a degree of predictability and stability in the Russia relationship. That does not strike me, reading the book and knowing Fiona and listening to Paul, predictability and stability do not strike me as the things that are most likely to emanate from Putin's Russia. So I want to do a quick answer from each of you, and then we'll do a longer discussion. A quick answer from each of you. Should Biden have gone to this summit, and will anything come out of it? Kathryn, you go first.
So it is peculiar that he did it, and in a sense, it looks like he's rewarding Putin for kind of bad behavior. Recall that in April, when this invitation went out, there were purportedly about 100,000 or so troops, Russian troops, amassing on the Ukrainian border, and so once an offer of a direct one-on-one meeting was made, those troops were, well, a few of them left anyway. We're not sure how many. Maybe Fiona knows more on that. So it looks as though, there's a causality there. It may just be that there's correlation. So a number of people are saying Biden shouldn't have done this because it does look like a reward for bad behavior. And after all, Alexei Navalny has been not just poisoned, but imprisoned, and now his organization has been banned. And even if you've retweeted something from their social media accounts in Russia, you could be fined or charged with some sort of crime. So why do this meeting? Well, other options would have been meeting on the sides of a G20. One argument is that, there is a theory within the administration that they want to focus on China, not on Russia. And so Biden is delivering a message here at this meeting to essentially to Putin to basically calm down, or we'll do, X, Y, and Z. And in particular, in cyber areas, remember that cyber, there are two dimensions. One is what the Russian government itself does, so the SolarWinds infiltration, for example. The other is what cyber criminals that we think are in Russia or are Russian speaking are doing, and presumably the Russian government could crack down on that. However, one reason it may tolerate them is because the deal is you don't do any of that within Russia, do it somewhere else, and we'll abide it. So it could be to deliver that message. It could also be to pursue this strategic stability, which is to inject some predictability into nuclear arms control, and that should be attractive to Russia as well. But a force multiplier, and I'll end with this, as we've discussed for Putin's Russia, is disruptive capacity, right? So there are many areas where Putin's Russia doesn't want stability and predictability. That's a power tool for them, being unpredictable. But in some areas, they may want predictability. We want predictability, I think, because we would like to turn and focus a little bit more on China.
Paul, if you were sitting at the NSC and had to write the guidance, would you have suggested that he go or suggested that he not?
I think it's totally fine that he's going to speak with them. And the reason why is, let's be honest, I think that whether you were a fan of Donald Trump or whether you were a critic of Donald Trump, by and large, him going to meet with Kim Jong-un turned out to actually not be a bad idea. And I think people on both sides would agree with that. I think where the criticism comes in is maybe there wasn't enough follow-up. There wasn't enough, but keep in mind, prior to him meeting with it, there was the same thing. Oh, we can't meet with him because that rewards bad behavior. We can't do this. And then he met with them, and then people were like, well, okay, maybe it's not so much about that. It's about, let's actually get something out of this. And so I think that there's less of a concern about rewarding bad behavior or not rewarding bad behavior. It's more of, if you're going to meet with this person, let's get something out of this, right? And I think that, so I really think it comes down to that. Unfortunately, I just don't think there is much that can come out of this. As I said to some other people, I'm expecting a lot of dialogue about dialogue. And that's about it. Let's make sure that we're on terms. Let's try to, something else, we don't need Russia to be constructive. We just don't want them to be disruptive. Right. And that's the thing. Now, can he accomplish that? I don't think so. But establishing dialogue is at least a first step towards that. But that's about all that I can see. I mean, it's very similar to extending New START. It's not that extending New START solved anything. It just gave more time to find a potential solution. And so for me, yes, I think it was fine for him to meet. The question is what will come out of it. And the most I could see coming out of it is dialogue about dialogue.
Jaw is better than war, as was famously once said by one of Fiona's earlier countrymen. Fiona, what about you? Would you have made the recommendation to go, and or what would you tell Biden to do in the meeting?
Look, I have to say that I think, Kathryn and Paul have laid it out very clearly. I think, as Kathryn pointed out, the optics of the offer of a meeting, were probably the most problematic part of it. I suppose a case might be made that perhaps by making that offer in that time frame, that it did, help to reduce some of the tensions with all the military positioning on the borders of Crimea onto the border with Ukraine, from annexed Crimea by Russia, and on the borders with the Donbass. But, it's hard to say if that was the case. I mean, Russia was clearly signaling that it means mischief and malice towards Ukraine. I mean, that's fairly clear. I think, as Paul and Kathryn are both saying, we can't expect that much out of it. But I don't see the fact of having a meeting as being appeasement in any way, or kind of engagement for engagement's sake. And Paul is spot on, in fact, on Kim Jong-un and Trump. I'm the first to say that the meeting in Helsinki was not the best in terms of the press conference. But I think that overshadowed the fact in Helsinki that there were some modest steps forward, which are probably the same modest steps forward that come out of Geneva, by the way. But also the Trump, as a result of all the other things that happened around it, didn't get credit for actually taking the edge off the confrontation with Kim Jong-un. Because if you go back to before those meetings and the love fest of letters, we were fully anticipating that Kim Jong-un might go off half-cocked and send a missile in the direction of Hawaii. And in fact, my brother and sister-in-law were on a boat in Hawaii on a family vacation with their in-laws, grandparents, the kids, for a big family holiday when the siren went off in Hawaii. And you can ask them how they felt, thinking that as they were watching the last dolphin, cresting over the wave on their, once-in-a-lifetime trip, or this was the end of their lifetime trip. I was just said that wasn't a nice afternoon for them. And we were genuinely thinking that Kim Jong-un was going to do something pretty awful at that time. And Trump, deflected attention away from that. Now, as Paul said, did we get something more out of it? Not so much, but we did take the edge off. And I think that that's the best that we can hope for here. Because in fact, we've been doing this going back to George W. Bush, not thinking back to Slovenia and the staring in the eyes, but trying to take the edge off what was a confrontation with Russia. At that point, to focus on Afghanistan and Iraq and all the other things that were happening. That was, the reset actually came much earlier than Obama. We've constantly been trying to figure out how do we deconflict this relationship with Russia and have, some management and stabilization of this confrontation. But there is a through line through this about what the Russians want that actually goes back to Helsinki and even before that. And Kathryn put a finger on it. Some discussion of strategic stability, arms control and non-proliferation. And as Paul was suggesting, it's not just because of New START, it's, where do we go from here? There's desires to have predictable meetings, an agenda, a set of meetings. The North Koreans wanted that. Look, we're starting to meet with the Iranians, and we do this all the time with the Chinese. And what are the Chinese doing? Multiple atrocities, terrible things as well. Not just to the United States exfiltrating data, threatening Taiwan, imprisoning Uyghurs, shooting at the Indians over the Himalayas. I mean, you name it, we can go down the list of things that China is doing, but nobody gets hysterical about us meeting with the Chinese, and they're the big system threat. So predictable sets of meetings that presumably will talk about our differences and pass strong messages, and, to try to sort of air grievances. And then, they also want to have, bizarrely enough, meetings of businesses, which sounds preposterous given, sanctions. But this gets back to something that Kathryn was talking about before, because Russia wants its business community to be taken seriously. And it is just oil and gas. It wants to diversify, and it wants the businesses that are not under sanctions to be out there as national champions. It knows it has to diversify, and its businesses are getting put under pressure by investors to, basically clean up their act on the environment, on social issues, and on governance. Well, good luck with that. But, the whole point is that Russia wants to be taken seriously also as an economic power beyond just oil and gas. So they actually do want something out of this as well. It's just, as Paul and Kathryn are saying, how we handle this and how we handle the expectations around it.
It's actually a very good pivot to a point that I want to try to bring in at least part of the remainder of our time, which goes to a really important passage in Kathryn's book, when you're looking, Kathryn, at the geographical scope and the kind of policy scope, you make this point that Russia's ability to influence activities in different regions and in different policy areas is amplified by its relationship to China and to India. And that has always struck me as quite important. If I think about the last 10 years or so, it seems to me we've often seen a system where, whether this is actually coordinated or simply understood, in a sense, Russia's out there at the sharp edge of tweaking the West. China's sitting back a little bit, but it provides a degree of economic and diplomatic cover to a lot of what Russia has done. And so I'm curious as to your thoughts about to what extent Russia would be behaving the way it is behaving were it not for that sort of top cover from China in terms of the U.S. relationship. India is maybe a slightly different question. Let's focus on China for now. Kathryn, just your thoughts on that?
I would say that it is, I call it in the book a force multiplier, and I think there's some debate about the closeness of the relationship between China and Russia. So remember, there's China and Russia, and then there's Putin and Xi, which and the interests of the men don't always overlap perfectly with the interests of the countries. Maybe more so with Xi than with Putin. But Putin's regime, survival, investment, keeping the economy going under sanctions, this is existential, right? When their economy dips, his big fear is social instability. And this is why Navalny, a guy who only gets 5% approval rating, he'd probably more easily be elected mayor of New York than he would be, mayor of Moscow, or he ran for mayor of Moscow, didn't win, or president of Russia. So why is Putin fearful of him? Well, because of the potential for social instability and those huge demonstrations. So with respect to relations with China, China has a huge need for energy. Russia has energy to provide, and so this keeps the economy going. And although Russians over the last year or so have seen their real incomes, well, more than the last year, they've seen their real incomes dip, but in particular in 2020, significantly. They remain under sanction for the foreseeable future, at least. And so, where is a good place to look for investment? China. And before COVID, there were a lot of Chinese entrepreneurs going to Moscow looking for investment. So I think it gets to the point that Fiona made about, they need investment. They need to diversify. China also has a high-tech industry. Russian labor is not cheap, but they have a lot of good programmers and they have a highly educated population. So there's some synergy in that respect. So I think it does help Russia. I want to also mention, Bruce, the Middle East helps the Russian economy too. Some of our great allies in the Middle East, like the Saudis. Russia has a kind of frenemy relationship, I think, with Saudi Arabia over oil. But, for a while there, they were price fixing on oil. Then they had a little war, and now they're back to price fixing again. I mean, that is a price war, not a hot war. But who else is investing in Russia as we and the Europeans are not? The Saudis, the United Arab Emirates, all of these, and India, as you mentioned, right? So Russia and India with pharmaceuticals. So there are other things Russia produces, and these places also are interested in those things. They're also interested in the northern passage through the Arctic because it moves goods faster. So China's interested in that too. So there are a lot of ways in which the synergies are there and tight, which is problematic for us in the United States if we're concerned about Russia and China acting together against us. I think it'll be hard to pry them apart, to be honest, in the near term.
And Israel also spending quite a lot of particularly spending a lot of time with the Russians, all of our most predictable allies, so to speak. Paul, you've thought a lot about alliance dynamics and concert dynamics. How do you see this?
So I think for me, Russia perfectly captures the phrase. I think it was Lord Palmerston famously said that there's no permanent friends, permanent allies, there's only permanent interests. And I think that Russia has always perfectly captured that unlike the ideas of, a Western alliance or Western system and so forth, Russia has always been throughout its history kind of this country that has just taken advantage of the situation, as necessary, has been very defensive. Some people would even say it's the perfect realist state, right? When we think of realism, it was rarely formed because we thought about Russia's behavior, which is kind of an idea that I'm wanting to develop more further in other work. But that's really, to me, when thinking about, well, how does Russia take advantage of the cover, if you will, offered by China? I mean, this is what Russia does. I mean, it was really to give an extreme example, when we think about the horrors of World War II, when we think about, for example, the Holocaust, the focus is on Germany. But then it was later when The Bloodlands was written by Tim Snyder, people go, oh, wait, no, it was Stalin and Hitler that were systematically killing people. It was like people kind of forgot that Russia was doing the same thing at the same time. And so there's a lot of examples where Russia has always kind of been able to utilize cover to pursue whatever its interests are at a particular time. And I think we're seeing that now with China. Kathryn laid out a lot of ways in which this is done. And so, to give you a really concrete example of how to think about this is part of the reason why I don't think something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization would ever become a NATO, right? It just wouldn't become the same way, because maybe not so much because of China, but because of Russia, that it's like, no, is this something we're going to be fully committed to? I just don't see it in the same way. So that's kind of where my mind goes when I hear about this comment about Russia aligning or utilizing. To me, this is something they've always done. They're the ultimate realist state.
Fiona, your thoughts on this one?
Sorry, I had my sound off there. I completely agree with Paul. I mean, I think that, perhaps the Russians wouldn't use that term, but that's exactly, the way that they approach things. And, Kathryn really lays that out in the book. I mean, for Russia, they also see allies as dependents, and they don't want to have any. Putin always talks about there being a very small number of truly sovereign countries in the world. And he would put Russia up there and China, and then he hesitates before he adds the United States, because he sees the United States as alliances, not as a form of strength, but a form of weakness. And ironically, that's what Trump thought too. Trump saw allies as supplicants, and he was always talking about the weakness of our allies because they always wanted something. And they wanted the United States to do something for them. And that's the way that Putin thinks. Putin wants alliances and these alignments without responsibility. And clearly, China doesn't expect Russia to take any responsibility for anything. In fact, Bruce, as you were kind of laying out there, there is, certain, perspective that China may have on, Russia as well. And as, Kathryn, is laying out, Russia might get some top cover, but it's not always getting, kind of an assist from China. In fact, when Russia annexed Crimea, China didn't recognize it and actually encouraged the Central Asian states at a conference, I think it was actually of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization at the time in Tajikistan, also not to recognize it. Now, one might kind of think, that's interesting, because surely China wants Taiwan back. But, China actually saw this as somewhat problematic, in fact, and, didn't like the idea that, kind of Russia at that point was disrupting the international order. And in fact, Russia's annexation of Crimea could cause some problems for Russia with China down the line. And, I think that this kind of comes out in that slight awkwardness of, the relationship as, Kathryn is sort of describing. It looks like a strategic partnership. It looks like a lot of alignment, Russia doing a lot of the heavy lifting, being the heavy, as Paul put it, for China by constantly tweaking and clubbing, the West and, these smaller players. But Russia also sits on a whole bunch of former Chinese territory. And although they were very quick to, basically resolve those border disputes back in 2000 and onwards, under both Yeltsin and then under Putin, as Paul is saying, they don't have the problem, they don't have the ability of everything stopping at the water. That's not where that border is. They've got a border that's as long as Canada and the United States. And as, Kathryn's saying, apart from you and Bruce infiltrating, we're not too much worried about, what Canada's going to do. But Russia and China and the Soviet period, they had clashes on that border along the Amur River. And China, nationalists unleashed, not the state itself, often make comments about that being part of Chinese territory. So at some point, if things changed, what's to stop China, not now, but, somewhere way down the line, doing a Russia with Crimea? because Russia had actually recognized Ukraine's sovereignty over Crimea back in 1994. But then Putin said, well, circumstances changed. Well, circumstances might change with China. So I think there are a lot in that longer term of issues that, we might want to contemplate. But in the shorter term, as Kathryne's saying, they're not thinking about that. In the shorter term, they're out on their subversion. Somewhere down the road, they might want to balance things out a little bit, but we're just not there yet.
And as Keynes famously said, in the long term, we're all dead.
Yeah, I think that's what Putin thinks, but not until before 2036.
Kathryn, 30 seconds, final thoughts from you before we have to close.
Well, first, thank you all for, again, the time and attention to my book and the kind comments. And, we live in fascinating times, and, Russia is always important. But I think it's particularly important right now, as we're seeing. And thank you very much for the discussion, and I look forward to continuing it.
And we'll see what happens tomorrow in the summit, whether indeed, as you have all predicted, very little comes out of it, but maybe nonetheless a lowering of temperatures and a management of what otherwise might be a very disruptive challenge. Thank you all for being here. I highly recommend that you buy Kathryn's book, but I also recommend that you buy Paul's book and Fiona's book, which are all still relevant to the debates that we're having today.
Me too.
Not just about the nature of Russia, but about how the West should respond. So thank you all for being here. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.